There's a moment some people never plan for. A message appears. A conversation becomes slightly deeper than usual. And suddenly, you feel something you didn't expect. Not love, not exactly desire, but attention. You tell yourself it's harmless, just conversation. Yet somewhere inside, a quiet tension forms. Because a question begins to rise. Why do people risk everything for something like this? And the answer is rarely as simple as betrayal. Problem deep dive. When people hear the phrase extramarital affair, they often imagine one thing: a bad person making a bad decision. But real life rarely works that cleanly. Most affairs don't begin with dramatic intentions. They begin quietly, at work, online, in ordinary conversations. At first, nothing feels dangerous. It's just someone who listens, someone who notices small things. Over time, that attention becomes meaningful, and meaning becomes emotional investment. What makes this confusing is that the person involved may still care deeply about their partner. They may still value their relationship, yet something inside them starts to shift. Psychologists call this emotional displacement. It happens when emotional energy that once belonged to one relationship begins flowing somewhere else. Not all at once, gradually. And because it happens slowly, the brain often doesn't register it as a threat at first, which leads to a deeper question. If most people value loyalty, why does the mind sometimes move in the opposite direction? To understand that, we have to look at what the brain is actually seeking. Reframe. Before we go deeper, one thing needs to be clear. Understanding the psychology behind affairs is not the same as justifying them. It's simply recognizing something about human behavior. The brain does not pursue betrayal. It pursues needs. Needs for attention, novelty, validation. When those needs are met inside a relationship, the brain usually stays anchored. But when those needs begin to fade, something subtle happens. The mind starts scanning the environment, not for another partner, but for another source of emotional reward. This is not a moral failure of the brain. It's a biological adaptation. Your mind evolved to seek connection, recognition, and emotional stimulation. The problem is that this system sometimes activates in the wrong context, which brings us to the deeper mechanism driving many affairs. Psychological mechanism. Inside your brain, there's a powerful motivational system. It's called the dopamine reward circuit. This system activates whenever something feels new, exciting, or meaningful, not necessarily sexual, simply novel. Long-term relationships tend to become predictable. Predictability creates safety, but novelty creates dopamine, and dopamine creates attention. Here's a helpful metaphor. Imagine your brain like a spotlight. In the early stages of a relationship, the spotlight focuses intensely on your partner. Every detail feels interesting. Every interaction feels rewarding. Over time, familiarity dims that spotlight, not because love disappears, but because the brain becomes efficient. When someone new appears who triggers curiosity, the spotlight shifts. Suddenly, conversations feel fresh again. Your brain interprets this as emotional importance, but what it's really responding to is novelty-driven reward. Behavioral psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement. When attention comes unpredictably, like occasional messages or compliments, it becomes even more addictive. The brain starts anticipating the next interaction, and anticipation releases dopamine,
which explains why many affairs feel emotionally intense, not because the connection is deeper, but because the brain is experiencing reward uncertainty. However, this mechanism alone doesn't explain everything, because not everyone responds to it the same way, and that leads us to the next layer of psychology.
Practical framework. Understanding these patterns helps you see something important. Affairs rarely begin with one dramatic decision. They emerge through small psychological steps. Here are 5 patterns worth recognizing. 1. Emotional drift. What to do? Notice where your emotional attention goes during difficult moments. Why it works in the brain. The mind naturally seeks emotional regulation. When one relationship stops providing comfort, the brain looks elsewhere. Real-life example. After a stressful day, you find yourself texting someone outside your relationship first. That shift is subtle but meaningful. 2. Validation hunger. What to do? Pay attention to how strongly you react to external compliments. Why it works in the brain. Validation activates reward circuits tied to self-worth. If those circuits feel deprived, the brain becomes more sensitive to outside approval. Real-life example. A colleague praises your ideas, and the interaction lingers in your mind longer than expected. 3. Emotional secrecy. What to do? Notice when conversations begin to move into hidden spaces. Why it works in the brain. Secrecy intensifies dopamine through psychological scarcity. The mind perceives hidden interactions as more meaningful. Real-life example. You start deleting messages or avoiding mentioning someone's name. 4. Gradual boundary shifts. What to do? Observe how boundaries change over time. Why it works in the brain. The brain normalizes repeated behavior. Small shifts become the new baseline. Real-life example. What once felt inappropriate now feels harmless because it has happened many times. 5. Emotional substitution. What to do? Ask yourself where your emotional support truly comes from. Why it works in the brain. Attachment systems prefer consistent emotional regulation. If one connection stops providing it, another may take its place. Real-life example. Sharing your worries with someone outside the relationship instead of your partner. None of these patterns automatically lead to an affair, but they reveal something important. The mind is constantly redistributing emotional energy, and that redistribution often happens quietly. Which leads us to a simple but powerful mental model.
Integration. Think of relationships as emotional ecosystems. Energy flows between people. Attention, care, validation. When the ecosystem stays balanced, the connection remains stable. But when emotional resources shift somewhere else, the system destabilizes. Extramarital affairs are rarely the beginning of a breakdown. They are usually the symptom of one. Not always, but often. This doesn't mean relationships are fragile. It simply means the human mind is dynamic. Attention moves, needs change, and awareness becomes the only thing that stabilizes the system. In the end, the psychology of affairs reveals something deeper about human nature. People rarely seek betrayal. They seek recognition. Recognition that they matter, that they are seen, that their presence still carries meaning. When those signals fade, the brain looks for them elsewhere. Not because commitment disappears, but because attention is one of the strongest emotional currencies the mind understands. Which leaves a quieter question behind. Not simply why people cheat, but why human beings are so deeply shaped by the need to be noticed. And once you understand that, you begin to see relationships differently.